The story of The Last of Us is not nearly as hidden or requiring of deduction as a lore video usually indicates, but it's still worth going over the information for those who want it all in one place. In that the game is all about the characters and their experience and life in the world, I want to first establish a timeline. I hope to decipher at least a few ages for the characters later on, but I will have to come back to them individually. However, I feel a timeline is important to establish early on. In the prologue, Sarah can pick up a newspaper that has word of the infection beginning. This newspaper is dated September 26, 2013. This means that, like many entertainment sources that have attempted the end-of-the-world scenario, it is supposedly going to occur in our near future. During the somewhat long, but all beautiful prologue, we learn that 20 years have passed and that it is now summer. That either means that it hasn't quite been 20 years, as it is the summer of 2033, or it's been just slightly over, and is the summer of 2034. Knowing the progress of the game, that you end up traversing through all 4 seasons before arriving into summer again, I'm inclined to believe the former. That would mean that the 20-year claim holds more true, and is passed in full by the end of the game. Not that this really matters, but for the sake of lore, I want to be as precise as possible with the timeline. As for the virus itself, it is an offshoot of a real-life fungal parasite that affects insects and arachnids. This parasite in real life is of the cordyceps family, and more technically called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, though you'd be a fool to trust my pronunciation on that 100%. The parasite works very similar to how the infection works in the game. A host is attacked, and over time its tissue is replaced. In the meanwhile, the host will travel to a better location so that when it dies, it is nearer to other sources of possible infection. This is because, just like in the game, the death of the host leads to another spawning point. This is a continuation of life for the parasite, which really is just another living organism, no matter how terrifying it may be. The good news is that, as far as I could research with the limited time I allowed myself, there has been no reported cases of this parasite affecting humans. Of course, this is untrue in The Last of Us, and the game's parasite has an additional method of spreading, that of a viral contact through a bite delivered by an infected victim. Being that the parasite is a living creature, we must assume that it began with the releasing of spores. It wouldn't make any sense for the outbreak to begin with biting, because those doing the biting would first have to be infected. One thing the game never makes mention of is how the outbreak began. From a story perspective, we don't need to know. The narrative works perfectly without such information, and it frankly makes sense that the answer would never be found. In one night the entire world went to hell, or at least North America did. A number is never really given on the total that perished or became infected, and that's partially the point. The world went to hell rapidly, with the government of the United States becoming fractured and dictatorial. It's unlikely that anyone, or enough of anyone, survived to ever find out those kinds of answers, and the safety of researching those kinds of answers ceased to exist. Before I go further on a tangent, let me reach my point, that the outbreak had to begin by the spreading of spores, or at least the transmission of them. This spreading, or releasing, was not an act of any man, but of the fungus itself. We don't know why this would happen, and so suddenly, but I could not help to be reminded of the movie The Happening. Forget about your opinion of the movie, and the acting especially, and focus with me on the plot device. In The Happening, nature itself unleashes an airborne virus, via plants, that infect humans and drive them to nearly instant suicide. It can only be speculation, but what if the cordyceps in The Last of Us is operating with a similar agenda? Nature certainly does seem to thrive only 20 years after humanity has begun to fall. Vines, trees, and water have overtaken the cities in some portions of the game more than they possibly could even after 100 years. What we do know about the infection is the following. In the prologue, Sarah can pick up a newspaper that has a headline that reads, FDA expands list of contaminated crops. This suggests that the cordyceps was likely intelligent in tainting our food supply. The infected don't turn for 2 days, which would cause them in the meantime to seek assistance from other humans, putting them in easy range of other target sources for infection. Especially at the beginning, when no one knew a zombie-esque virus was occurring. The hospitals and clinics would have been packed full of patients and those trying to help them. With the mass numbers being affected, it's safe to say that churches and other gathering spots would also have groups packed in together. While we don't actually know how far the infection has spread, the game does throw information our way that seemingly has to be believed. In the opening credits, there are clips of broadcasters delivering news, the most important of them being, panic spreads worldwide because the vaccination efforts have failed. This would suggest that the entire world likely is infected, or at least affected. A favorite movie of mine, 28 Days Later, creates a valid dichotomy in that all of England goes to hell when the rage infection starts, because as far as they know, the entire world has gone to hell. At the same time, as a bit character in the movie suggests, how could the infection cross the rivers and the oceans? In the movie, it has not, and it turns out that only England was affected. The same could be said for The Last of Us. We know the infection is in North America, and it is aggressive enough to spread to all corners of the land. I have no problems believing this. However, could it somehow cross the oceans and infect the remainder of the world? This is unlikely. Except that the news clip in the credits suggests such, which means that the tainted food was probably not limited to North America. There are two possibilities here, and they both could easily be true. One, that the tainted food was shipped around the world, and two, that the infection spawned in various places, to help infect the entirety of humanity. The infection actually has an interesting pattern that remains somewhat in line with the real-life Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. The first stage is what is known as runners and stalkers in the game. They are closest to what resemble the zombies of many other games and movies. Their goal is to quickly get as close to target sources of infection, the same as with the real-life cordyceps. This is also true of the second stage, the stalkers. What's unique and strange about the in-game infection is that the runners also have a rage behavior similar to 28 Days Later. They will not just infect a person, but also bite and beat them to death. This is very peculiar because, as I will explain in a short time, the target needs to be alive in order to continue spreading the infection. A dead host cannot become infected, and is nothing more than a corpse. It is unexplained as to why this is, but I have a guess based on the third stage of the infection, that of the clickers. These infected have been so for far longer, and they cease their rage of killing a target. Instead, they will always bite the victim, giving them the infection. It is unclear if this bite kills the host, although I do have to admit that it is very likely, with the obscene nature of the wound for that 1 second when we get a glimpse. Not only is this behavior true, but their appearance and abilities have altered. The fungi infection of clickers has mutated so strongly that it has spread out from inside the victim's head and caused complete blindness. In exchange for this, clickers use echolocation. In short, this means they make their clicking sound for which they are named, and the vibrations bounce back to them from the surrounding area. If an object is moving or making noise, they can detect it because it interferes with or alters their returning clicks. Now, returning to why I believe runners and stalkers behave differently from clickers, it has to do with the amount of mutation. It is notable that it would seem, when playing the game, that runners and stalkers still retain human traits, including being in pain and making pain sounds because of the infection, or being killed. This is not true for clickers. They make sounds upon being killed, but not those that register as human, which means the other two are likely more human than infected, in terms of ratio comparison anyway. This could be because they are in fact human, and perhaps our advanced brain, or immune system, does a partial job of resisting the infection, for a time, in a minor way. Instead of simply becoming a way in which to infect, they attempt to kill their targets. Hell, it could be to avoid spreading the infection, the white blood cell's only effort to remain in control by killing the sources for further infection. That's a lot of speculative hoopla, and while it sounds plausible enough, it's something we can never know. This is especially true because in-game we have nothing to compare this infection to. There is the fact that this cordyceps does not have this violent stage in real life, but it also doesn't have the option of biting others to spread the infection. In the real world, the infected always die to become spore pods, and that's it. The weirdest part about the infected is that, again like the rage infected from 28 Days Later, they will not just bite or kill their targets. They will continue to eat and claw at them, as seen by the first time Joel and Tess come across a group of runners. Two of them are gathered around a corpse, going to town on it. This is a person who dies in that moment, but even still, they eat and attack continuously. It's unfortunately unclear if they are doing this out of rage or to feed. This behavior also isn't seen in the remainder of the game, which is a true shame. There are two more stages of the infection, the next being what the game refers to as bloaters. Now, this is not a technical term, but rather a rough physical description of a person who has been infected for so long that they are covered in fungi that has spread to make them appear bloated. This stage is actually near the end of the infection's life cycle, but comes with a twist. They cannot be approached closely at all because they will immediately infect those who do, but more importantly, they are capable of throwing spore pods that explode and release the infection. These spore pods do not have to instantly kill a person, and outside of that being a game mechanic, let's assume there is a reason. That reason, of course, is because the primary goal of the infected is to spread the infection. As a side note, yet important, the spores themselves need to be discussed before the last stage. The spores thrown by a bloater do not kill instantly, and in fact they can be lived through without an affliction. They can even be bandaged up as with any other wound. To some degree this seems as a game mechanic, but not the whole reason. When you reach the dam, Joel is explaining to Tommy of Ellie's immunity, and he specifically says, "I've seen her ingest enough spores to take down a dozen men." This implies that there has to be a certain amount, because we all know a small amount of spores can be lived through, as experienced when fighting a bloater. They likely pass through the body unable to infect because their presence is not strong enough. It is also likely that the amount of spores required to infect a person is not constant, and varies depending on your size and weight. I say this because Joel chooses the example of grown men, which are typically the largest examples of human beings. This takes us to the last stage of the infection, death. It's unclear in my opinion if this stage is only reached by a bloater finishing its life cycle, despite the wiki stating that this is the case. I find it unclear because the corpses are never more than taut skin on bones, with no signs of bloating or mutation at all, save for small amounts of fungi growing off of small areas of the skin. It's fair to guess that this could be because after the victim dies, the fungi also dies away, or better yet, bursts into the air as a spore cloud. This could very well be the case, and I see no reason to argue with it. However, there isn't actual evidence that only those infected who have gone through the entire life cycle become sources for the spores. What does suggest this, though, is that those areas of the game are few and far between, despite how much traveling the characters undertake. As for what happens to the world outside of the infection's effects, we can first turn to the same news clips in the opening credits. One of the things that's stated is that Los Angeles is the latest city to fall under martial law. Just in case someone hearing me does not know what martial law can entail, it means in simple terms an armed military force taking control when other government has failed. This failure does not have to be a true fault, but can simply also be too big an issue for the local government or authorities to handle. While this is obviously true, as no city or state government could hope to contain the cordyceps infection, or even the country's government, there is more to it than that. It would seem that quite easily, and in a utilitarian fashion, those who wanted to rise to power did so. There is another audio clip stating that, with the bureaucrats out of power, we can finally take the necessary steps. These steps are not to truly fight the infection, of course, as it is still running free and deadly 20 years later. Two other clips worth mentioning are as follows. All residents are required to report to the designated quarantine zones, and a statement saying that the Fireflies are calling out for the return of all three branches of government. Stating that they desire all three branches is different wording than stating that they want the government to return at all. To me this means that one or two of the branches remain, likely run by the person or group holding a martial grip on the entire country. Who these people or this person could be is unknown and, I suppose, unimportant. Regardless, what the martial law has effectively done is not attempt to protect the citizens from the infection, but instead contain them, to protect them from themselves. In effect, this is treating them as prisoners. The quarantine zones are nothing more than a code word for internment camps. This is initially achieved without argument or fight for two reasons. One, the more significant, because outside of these camps rages an infection that can kill any and every person. People are terrified and willing to do anything to stay alive. Two, the government has been mostly dismantled, so there is no process to decide whether these zones are ethically acceptable or not. Some interesting things about the quarantine zones. There is a strict curfew of 6 p.m., and if you are not indoors by this time, then you will be arrested and prosecuted. My assumption is that such strict living conditions stems from the fear of the Fireflies. Fear is not quite the right word. If you are on the streets after 6, you are possibly a conspirator. I suppose there's also the chance that if you are openly disobeying, then you might be infected, and unable to control your actions. The game actually gets confusing in my opinion as to how the quarantine zones function as far as handing out ration tickets and collecting them. All the citizens are required to work, to whatever degree this means. This is proven by Joel and Tess telling a guard near the beginning that they have the day off. We can also overhear a few small groups talking about working in and outside the zone, the latter a dangerous task that they thought only soldiers should do. The ration tickets are a part of the quarantine zone system, and therefore it must be this work that earns these tickets. Let me be clear that it has to be this work that earns these tickets, even if the real reason for the work is fear, and that the citizens are actually inmates and are worried they will be killed if they don't comply. The tickets exist. They aren't going to be handed out randomly by soldiers walking down the streets. The only feasible way for their earning to be conducted would be in connection with doing work. This has to be the truth, and yet certain people have large collections of them, enough so that extraneous work can be completed and paid for in a number of tickets that will allow Joel and Tess to eat for a few months. Those are Tess's words. What's strange about this to me is that means the pair would not have to show up for work for those 2 months either, and yet still claim their meals in the ration line. This must be the case, for why would anyone bother to earn a bunch of extra tickets and still go to work every day? If your schedule proceeds per normal, and your turning in of the tickets also must remain normal, then why earn the extra tickets? There's only a few things I can think of, one of which the game gives us as a response. Outside of the quarantine zones, there are small bartering places, none of which you can interact with in the game, but that are offering products in exchange for tickets. So as a citizen, you could find a way to earn extra tickets in order to buy items from the markets. Of course, that then brings up the question of what the non-citizens would do with these tickets. Surely they wouldn't sneak into a quarantine zone and expect to be able to stand in line for food. Perhaps it all eventually boils down to the hungry families collecting the tickets through the extraneous job grapevine. The big problem I have with this, however, is how the person paid for the job in tickets in the first place. For example, a person wants a job done and is willing to pay 10 tickets. How does this person have these 10 tickets in the first place? Did they starve for 10 meals? Perhaps they skipped lunch every other day for 20 days? My second theory is a likely one as well, in that there is corruption amongst the soldiers and military in general. I won't even bother going into an imaginary example, but extra tickets are handed out now and then for all kinds of reasons. However, what about the ration line, and the duty of showing up for work? No matter what I said above, it would be strange if certain people didn't show up for work regularly, and yet were always in the ration line. That it would not become suspicious. This leads me to my true deduction, which is quite simply that the whole thing isn't run very well. Communication is poor, a lot of the military personnel doesn't give a damn, and most are probably happy enough to not be in battle with the Fireflies or infected. So as long as the problem is between the citizens, let it remain their problem. Another quick thing about the military is that the infection was first dealt with, to some degree, as if a threat of war. The cities were bombed in the hopes of killing all those who were infected. Of course, this didn't work, as the number of infected is an incredibly larger number than the bombing could take care of. There's also the fact that the infected humans are in every nook and cranny of the country, or the world, and so the bombing only destroyed a small percentage of their total population. While the game is truly a story about two specific characters, Joel and Ellie, there are others who exist as supplemental elements to their tale, the first of these being Tess, the fiery and extremely capable female companion of Joel's. We don't know anything of Tess's past, how she came up to be in the quarantine zone, or why she is connected with Joel. What we do know is that the two of them are seemingly in a relationship. We aren't given a clue as to Tess's age, but my guess would be in her mid-30s. She's certainly an adult and wise enough to survive for 20 years in the infected world. Mid-30s would put her old enough to be with Joel, and yet young enough to look as young as she does. For the most part, she and Joel only seem as partners in their aversion of the law and killing infected, but there are small hints throughout the game and then a tell toward the end of Tess's story. The way in which they speak to each other is a big clue. Things such as Joel calling her ma'am with a smirk in his voice, or Tess calling Joel Texas, Tex, and Big Guy. When you first get outside the quarantine zone, Joel says to Tess that they haven't been out here in a while, and Tess casually replies that it is like they are on a date. In response to this, Joel says, "Well, I am the romantic type." In quick reply, Tess states with a smile, "You got your ways." What we also learn because of Tess is that a cure for the infection has been presented before and been proven false. It's only a minor point, but when she and Joel first learn that Ellie is supposedly immune and that there are doctors researching a cure, they complain that they've heard such a thing before. Of the two of them, Tess is apparently the optimist because she is almost immediately believing the immunity true. At the very least, she realizes that trying for the cure is a better option than anything else, be it returning to the quarantine zone or otherwise, especially with the military after them. It is actually Tess that has the first of two proofs for Ellie's immunity being true. At the end of her story arc, she reveals that she was bitten 1 hour prior in the museum. In comparison to the 3-week-old bite on Ellie's arm, Tess's wound is severe. It is because of these elements that poor Tess decides to sacrifice herself in the hopes of buying enough time for Joel and Ellie to escape the military. She separates herself and has a standoff with the soldiers, in which she is killed. This is where the big tell comes into play for the relationship existing between Tess and Joel. In her plea to Joel for him to continue escorting Ellie, she states, "There is enough here for you to feel some obligation to me," as in they have enough of a relationship that Joel would perform the escort task for her. I originally thought, before the game was released, that Tess was going to be a pain-in-the-ass character who manipulated Joel. In case somebody doesn't know, it has been revealed that she was originally going to be the primary antagonist. We can't know what the plot would have been, but there is a picture that is unlockable amongst the concept art in-game that shows her with a knife to Joel's neck. This would explain why I felt the way I did about her before knowing anything. It turns out she was the only thing remaining that was important to Joel, which made her death all the more depressing. At least the game did a great job of not allowing the time to feel grief, as you had to keep moving to protect Ellie. Bill is a varied character who brings up more questions than he answers, but the questions don't really even need answering. His weapon of choice, aside from the shotgun, is a kukri, or kukuri, a Nepalese machete. He is also supposedly good with a bow. Joel's response upon Ellie asking if this is the case is that he reckons Bill does. Bill is a paranoid loner who is also somewhat lost without his partner Frank. That word partner is not entirely without two meanings. It's unclear if Frank and Bill were actually a couple, but we do know that Bill is at least gay. The only real proof is when Ellie looks at his stolen porno mag of Bill's, and it is essentially an off-brand playgirl. There is also a moment in which, when coming upon Frank's corpse, Bill is rather emotional. He lost a work partner, true, but his emotions seem stronger than that. The game does not give the full story, but what it does give is a note from Frank stating how he hates Bill and hopes to never see him again. He would rather risk death than to stay with Bill any longer. This note certainly has an air of a lover's spat. It is Joel who finds the letter, and upon handing it over to Bill, he becomes upset again, tossing the letter away. Whatever the story behind their parting, Joel expresses his sorrow for Bill's loss, and in my opinion there is a similarity to how he lost Tess. This would further define that Bill and Frank were some variation of a couple. As for what happened to Frank, he was bitten twice. Bill points out the wounds and reveals that Frank hung himself to escape turning. It is unnecessary to bother pointing out, but this is the game proving that the infected are not actually zombie-like at all. No, the infected are completely alive, tortured by the infection, and death is death no matter what. Otherwise, Frank would have turned into a runner hanging by his neck, akin to what happened in The Walking Dead. Bill runs his own little town, which is not much more than an area set up with traps to keep looters and hunters out. A letter can be found in the game that is addressed to Joel, from Tess, that states how Bill is making runs for them. It isn't fully clear if this is a trade between them, or if the three of them work together. Since nothing about payment is written down, I'm inclined to believe the latter. Bill acquires items, gives them to Tess and Joel, who then sell them inside the quarantine zone, where there are a lot of people. What we do know is that Bill and Joel don't have nearly as much interaction as he and Tess do. When approaching Bill's city, Joel makes a guess at the man's location, prompting Ellie to ask if Joel has been there before. Joel admits that he has not. The only other thing we know about Bill is that he owes Joel a large favor. We don't have any idea of what for, and in what regard, but it's such a large favor that Bill is compelled, despite his xenophobic nature and disliking of Ellie, to help Joel locate and construct a car. And then one last interesting moment involving Bill. At a certain point, Bill makes the statement that, as bad as the infected are, it's normal people that scare him, and that Joel of all people should understand that. Ellie questions what this means, and Joel replies nothing with a hint of regret. In my opinion, this could be a moment of reference to either one of two things: Joel losing Sarah to a soldier's gunfire, or Joel acting near enough to a hunter. My guess is the latter, because it's only a short while later in the game that Joel admits to Ellie that he has been such. As quick as they come, they leave, and it's their supplemental nature that makes them great. We don't know Henry's age, but he is clearly an adult, or close enough, and my guess is that he is in his early 20s. What supports this guess is the fact that he refers to Joel as an old man, albeit without insult, multiple times. There is also the fact that he is Sam's older brother, which means, on a typical basis, he wouldn't be too much older. Sam's age we almost know, and is very likely 13. He asks Ellie her age, and after she responds 14, she then asks Sam his age. He replies that he is the same, but Henry calls him out. Sam corrects himself to say that he is close, to which Henry snickers. This could mean that he is 13 and still has the better part of a year before reaching 14, or that he is actually 12 or even 11. The game doesn't clarify, and any of them could be the case. If the true age is 13, then Henry is snickering to poke fun at his younger brother. However, if Henry truly finds the answer of close to be funny, then it would imply that he is not actually close, as in 10, 11, or 12. Two things that support the different rationalizations are first, the fact that Sam's voice is rather deep, even for a 13-year-old, but second, that he was interested in taking the toy robot. So if you want to believe 13, have at it, and if you want to believe younger than that, you could also be correct. The goal of this pair is simple: to survive and find security. Henry tells Joel that they are seeking the Fireflies for protection, and that's all there is to it. They were a part of a larger group, a group that entered Pittsburgh in search of supplies. The man and woman that are seen being gunned down by the Humvee are likely of this group, or were. Suggestion of this is upon overhearing the hunters in Pittsburgh talk, in which they say they've killed the man and the woman, and only the guy and the kid remain. This guy and kid are Henry and Sam. What makes them different, Henry in particular, is that they come back to rescue Joel and Ellie. Henry even asks Joel if he would have done the same because he knows the answer is no. They did still abandon the pair originally when being chased by the Humvee, and I do consider it bull when Henry says he escaped because he knew Joel would have a good chance of making it. I don't want to tear down Henry when he might be the only partially worthwhile adult in the game, but when he chose to abandon Joel, Ellie was safe. He had probably expected Ellie to go with him, to safety, and then felt guilty because she returned to danger by Joel's side. That said, there still is some merit to the fact that he rescued them from the water. Would Joel have done the same? I doubt it. Besides, Henry and Sam deserve a little respect because of how their tale ends. During the end of the suburbs section, Sam is bitten on the ankle, which causes him to become infected within about 12 hours. The infected Sam tackles Ellie, and when Joel attempts to fetch his gun from his backpack, Henry shoots at Joel, claiming that it is his brother. For a moment this is to be taken as a sign that Henry won't allow Sam to be shot, even with Ellie's life in immediate danger, but this is not the case. He stops Joel because Sam is his, Henry's brother, and he's going to be the one to put him down. It would have been interesting if Henry had attempted to go on despite the trauma, but this is not the case. First he gives a verbal blaming to Joel, which I take as nothing more than a desperate person emotionally strung out in their last moments. Last moments they are, too, because Henry is unable to cope with what he has just done and takes his own life. We don't know a whole lot about Ish and his companions that lived in the sewer. Ish was a man that went out to sea, or at least onto a large lake. The game doesn't actually specify what body of water Ish found safety upon. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is obviously not that close to any ocean, but there are also not any large lakes nearby. Now, Joel and Ellie jump into the Ohio River and must be rescued from that by Henry. The shore they wake upon must be along this river, perhaps on Brunat Island. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I've never been to Pittsburgh. This island is very near to the bridge that it's jumped from, and it's believable that the sewers could be a link between the island and the southwest suburbs of Pittsburgh. So, what I'm getting at is I suppose that Ish simply went up and down the Ohio River until enough time had passed, and then attempted to land on Brunat Island. I say attempted because the boat we come across is wrecked, which is why I believe that Ish did not return to the water when his society was ruined. His camp consisted of people from the nearby suburbs. A note can be found written by a father who was contacted by Ish with the proposal of moving into the sewers. For a while it seemed as if this sewer hideout was working, and then one door was apparently left open and the infected got in. In a short time it would seem that everyone either perished or fled. We thankfully know that some people did get away from the sewers, as a note was put on the outside of the Axis building, adjacent to the suburbs, reading that infected are within. A warning. Unfortunately, we know that many did not make it out. There are plenty of infected within the sewers. Even worse is the room containing a pile of child-sized corpses and a note stating that their deaths would be made quick. There's not much more to be known about Ish or his group, but I do want to speculate one thing. The suburb section of the game has us fighting a group of hunters. Who are these hunters, however? What would have happened to the sewer crew after they were forced to leave? Did they all return to the suburbs only to be slaughtered by the sniper and his buddies? Or are they the sniper and his buddies? That's my guess, as it makes killing them even more pathetically poetic. Tommy is an extremely important character, but one with little placement in the overall story presented in the game. He's the one who originally saves Joel's life from the soldier when the infection first goes rampant. Afterward, the details are unclear, but we know that Joel and Tommy work together to survive. As for Tommy's age, he is yet another character in which we can't say specifically. I don't want to cover Joel's age yet, and yet it is highly relevant, so let me just say for now that I would guess Tommy to be in his early 40s in the present and early 20s in the prologue. I will explain when we get to the Joel section. At the dam, when Tommy is refusing to assist Joel, Joel claims that he took care of them. Tommy comes back with the notion that he has nightmares because of those years. Joel then yells that they survived because of his actions, and Tommy states that it wasn't worth it. This gives credence to the notion that they survived together, but to say such a thing would mean that the things they did to survive were truly horrible. So horrible that Tommy wishes he were dead instead of having to remember. Now there's obviously some falsity to that statement, because Tommy is alive and starting a family, but I suppose the fairest thing to say is that Tommy is haunted by those years. After the initial survival, Tommy became a Firefly for a short while, and a valuable member at that. Marlene has nothing but positive words to say about him despite that he abandoned the cause. There's no steps given as to why Tommy left, or how he came across and joined up with those who are reconstructing the hydroelectric dam. This includes his relationship with Maria and the reforming of Jackson into a seemingly safe town. What's important about all of this is that they are achieving reconstruction of the dam, and actually have electricity again, perhaps the first non-government facility or location to do such. What I like about Tommy, as far as he relates to Joel, is how perceptive he is when it comes to his brother. Joel asks him to take Ellie to the Fireflies, but Tommy, despite saying that he will give his brother food and supplies, refuses the request. He doesn't refuse out of concern for his own safety, or to be an asshole toward his brother. His refusal is actually something that Joel himself does not quite pick up on. Tommy refuses because he won't take that girl off of Joel's hands. There is the argument that he won't just let his brother march into his life to dump some stranger off and then disappear, but I'm going to explain why I don't believe this is the case. Tommy is aware of how the girl, Ellie, is being perceived, and believes his brother to be better off finishing the escort on his own. That changes when he sees how Joel and Ellie interact with one another, because, by my guess, he understands just how much such a relationship could be affecting Joel. Tommy is also significant because he gives Joel and Ellie the key piece of information as to where the Fireflies can be located. This information, the University of Eastern Colorado, ends up being wrong, but it ultimately leads them to St. Mary's Hospital in Salt Lake City. While there's not a whole lot to touch on with the Hunters, a lore about The Last of Us can't go without touching them at all, especially since they play a major factor in my opinion of the end of the game. The Hunters are groups of humans who have banded together almost in a tribal-like existence. By that I mean they have structure, organization, and plans, but do not consider the society outside of their group. All they concern themselves with is themselves, and any humans outside of their tribe are merely fuel one way or another. They are either to be harvested for their material resources, are sustenance resources themselves, or are useful for sexual alleviation. I bring this up because, on a personal opinion, this is absolutely where I expect mankind to go if any form of an apocalypse were to occur. This is all that I think we are at our core, as mammals who are subjects of the survival of the fittest regimen. The military is attempting to do the exact same thing, except they are hoping to maintain order by continuing some form of a society. Their method is more trickery and slavery, where the Hunters simply want to kill all other tribes off. I also want to bring up David's group specifically for the sake of a complete lore. David is the leader of this group, proven in a few examples. He instructs James to get medicine, and when James explains that the others won't be happy about it, David tells him that it is not his concern. James does bring the medicine, however, as instructed. There's also the fact that David gets his way as far as imprisoning Ellie, so that she can be his next pet. Then, later on, when you are playing as Joel, you can overhear the Hunters talking about voting him out of leadership. This is not in a cutscene, but as you sneak around and avoid combat. It would seem that the group of Hunters you encounter at the university would also belong to David, although this part is slightly confusing. David states that it's only been a few weeks ago that his men were slaughtered, and yet that they went to a nearby town. A few weeks ago does suggest strongly that it was the university confrontation. Joel has been badly injured since then, and we don't know of anything between the dam and the university. The weather change is a little odd, with a full winter being in effect after only a few weeks, though it certainly does happen. Could Joel have survived longer than this without proper care? That is unlikely, so it had to have been a quick start to winter. Adding to the confusion, however, and hurting the quick winter start scenario, is the fact that David says the winter has been especially cruel. If it's only been a few weeks of winter, how does he know? The next 4 months could be blissful. Ignoring that slight time mishap, and probable oversight on Naughty Dog's part, David also specifically says that his group of men went to a nearby town. Now it's easy enough to assume that they decided to instead check out the university, but then why not have David say as much? Perhaps they didn't want to let him know they disobeyed? If they had gone to whatever town it was, then they wouldn't have gotten slaughtered. So if the few survivors tell David that they instead went to the university, David may have had them killed to make an example out of them. There is some validity to this idea in the trial note artifact. In short, this artifact tells a quick story of 2 members of a hunter group disobeying and being shot on sight because of it. This isn't from David's group, but they are all the same. However, I have a feeling this was for the tension to build appropriately from a story perspective. It already happens within a few seconds, as Ellie realizes what David is suggesting, but had he said university, then it would have been instantaneous. Either way, we can only assume that group belonged to David. It barely even matters, because either there is another adult man teenage girl team killing packs of hunters as they cross the country, or it was Joel and Ellie. Since I brought up the pet business, I do have to make sure that it's understood that David had every intention of raping Ellie. As for why he would seemingly kill her beforehand during the fighting sequences, I think has to do something with circumstance. At times she is being too resistant, as well as stabbing him, so it's better to kill her off. When David then finds her slowly crawling, his mindset reverts to rape. I believe the choking beforehand was so that she would cease her struggle and not to kill her. Now that I feel sick to my stomach, excuse me while I throw up, and then we can discuss the main characters. What's great about Ellie is how little we know of her, and yet have a complete person fleshed out. The facts of her life are handed out in blunt pieces, with little room for having concern beyond those facts. Ellie is 14 years old. She tells Joel this when he asks, and gives the same answer to Sam when he asks. As far as we know, she was born in the quarantine zone, and has spent her entire life there. Proof of this is that she is amazed by being outside, seeing it for the first time. She also will tell Joel that she spent some time in a military preparatory school, which is nothing but an orphanage. The location of the orphanage sparking this conversation is within what was formerly the Pittsburgh quarantine zone, so it's easily assumable that the Boston orphanage was no different. Ellie's parents are both dead, but as to how or when, we don't entirely know. We do know they are dead because when Joel asks about the location of her parents, Ellie responds with, "Where are anybody's parents? They've been gone a long time." We do know that they, or at least the mother, Anna, lived for at least 6 years in the New World because Ellie is 14, and the infection began 20 years prior. Ellie's mother was Marlene's friend, an important enough friend to look after her daughter. What we also know about Ellie's mother is that she was seemingly a Firefly. In the letter that Ellie keeps on her, we learn that Anna never liked kids except for the newborn Ellie. We also learn that Ellie did not seem to know her mother for long, or perhaps at all, aside from as a baby. The letter describes a scenario in which Anna is going to be gone shortly, sent on some important mission or another. She also tells Ellie to trust in Marlene, and putting the two together leads me to believe that Anna herself was a Firefly. One does get the sense that Ellie has been alone for a while, as she is not only bullheaded, opinionated, and swears as much as Joel, but she also has little problem taking life. One large diversion before going on about that, however. The biggest detail about Ellie is that she was bit, and is immune to the cordyceps infection. In fact, this is the entire purpose of the game. Ellie was bit 3 weeks before meeting Joel, and yet has not succumbed to the madness. There was another girl with her who also got bit, Riley. All that's particularly interesting about Riley is that she was also a Firefly. I say this because there is a pendant with her name in Ellie's possession. This is interesting because Ellie is said specifically not to be a Firefly. There's nothing stating that someone her age cannot be, as I'm sure both the military and the Fireflies will take any soldiers they can get. I'm guessing Ellie's lack of being issued a pendant is to help protect her from being arrested or killed by the military. There's also the fact that Riley and Ellie were bit while illegally exploring an off-limits mall. I have my personal doubts about an adult goofing off like this with such a risk to their lives, so I have to believe that Riley was around Ellie's age, and yet an official Firefly. As for Ellie's infection, there is still a mark on her arm, a rash combined with the formation of the bite, but she does not turn. I already stated that the first time an immunization is proven true is when Tess is bit in the museum and her sore looks drastically worse after only an hour. As an interesting sidebar, though related, the possibility of immunity and researching a cure are not news. When Ellie informs Tess and Joel that she is to be taken to doctors that are seeking a cure, Joel replies with a scoff that they have heard this before. The second occasion of proving Ellie's immunity is when she is in the spores shortly after Tess's death, when Joel and she are escaping the military. They enter into a subway station and tunnels that are highly polluted with spores. Joel is shocked by this and then believes her story for himself, which also means we the audience have to believe it. Toward the end of the game, we learn the immunization is because the infection has mutated differently during its first stage, when forming on the brainstem. The science behind this is left unknown, and understandably so, but it is a fact regardless. Returning to the fact that Ellie is capable of killing, that's not to say that she is as casual about taking life as Joel. In fact, the first time she takes up a gun and shoots the hunter attempting to drown Joel, she is as stunned as her escort. She's quick to get over it, though does state that she feels sick, but the fact that she was startled for a moment is very real. Further evidence of this can be seen when a few minutes later Joel asks her to be his sniper. He asks her not just to cover him, but to actively kill any of the hunters that she can. And she does. She will kill the majority of them if you are patient at that part of the game. After the fact, she stands up and once again seems startled, as if disbelieving of what she has done. She's not so weak to be mournful, but she's someone young enough to practically be a child and forced to kill. Much later on, she becomes harder, taking down hunters with her knife as casually as Joel does, or at least she behaves as if calm. An event happens in a burning building which causes Ellie to take up a machete and repeatedly slam it upon a man's head, over and over until only a chunky mess would have remained. This event is what finally broke her, and for two reasons. A man named David, a pedophile leading a group of hunters, imprisons Ellie, injures her, means to cut her into food, tortures her somewhat during the fight with him in the burning cabin, and ultimately pins her down with the strong hint that he is likely to commit rape. As said, his plans are interrupted when Ellie takes up his machete and brutally defends herself. She is utterly justified in doing so, but that doesn't change the impact the event has on her. When Joel swoops in after the fact to rescue her, he is saving her from herself. Ellie showed no signs of stopping her barrage, and Joel even has to snap her out of it by embracing her and verbally communicating that he's the one who has her. At this point, Ellie also says the line, "He tried to." She does not mutter about what she just did, but is scarred by the action nearly taken against her. Don't misunderstand, however. Her phrase, "he tried to," is to help her emotional state justify the horrific thing she just did, and it fails to work. Just a short while later in the game, though a season has passed, Ellie is not herself. She is zoned out, hardly registering what Joel is saying to her, despite his continual efforts. It is at this point that Joel suggests they turn about, and not bother seeking out the Fireflies, despite that they are hopefully close. This is because, I believe, Joel is sensing the remorse in her, and the desire to escape the turmoil inside. In response to this, Ellie says, "After all we've been through, after all I've been through, it can't be for nothing." The whole ordeal, her violent adventure with Joel, was depressingly hard on her, and she is almost desperate for it to have meant something. This is particularly true because she feels guilt over all the deaths that have happened around her, as if they are her fault. This is obvious toward the end of the game, but the two hints that are near the beginning are in the Billstown segment when she asks about Marlene and suggests that she will live despite that Joel is saying it is unlikely, and then also when Tess reveals that she is bit. At this point, when Tess reveals the bite, although Joel and Tess ignore her, Ellie makes a plea that she did not mean for this to happen, as if Tess being bit is a direct consequence of the woman escorting her. Then, in the last scene of the game, Ellie lists off those who have died around her, they being Riley, Tess, and Sam. It is not that she feels responsible. This is what Joel assumes, and Ellie interrupts him by saying that he does not understand. Instead of explaining what is really bothering her, Ellie asks Joel to swear that his story about the Fireflies is true, that they have given up and that there will never be a cure. This is what is important to her, and it is not a matter of feeling guilty. Ellie is not stupid. She is equipped enough mentally to know that she cannot be blamed for anyone's death. Well, aside from the hunters she takes down. No, what is bothering her is a much stronger sensation. Ellie is desperate to help, to not only find a cure, but to be a part of it. A cure means that the cordyceps infection will no longer haunt humanity. A cure means that all the fragmented groups can start to come together again. A cure means that no more 14-year-old girls will have to become survivors and also defend themselves with a machete from a spirited pedophile. Hearing that the Firefly cure is a bust is devastating to Ellie, but it is not the end. For a brief moment, when Joel swears that his story is true, her mind tosses with the choices that are presented to her. This same moment is what Henry would have gone through after shooting his brother. We all go through this moment many times in our lives, but mostly never on the same scale as Henry and Ellie had to. It can be seen in her eyes as she looks to the left and then back at Joel. She chooses to go on, to continue surviving, and verbally confirms this with, "Okay." One other thing I need to bring up really quick about Ellie is whether or not she is herself infectious. There's reasons why to believe she is, and reasons why to believe she's not, but let me just say, because it's not really worth going into, as it's not a true issue in the game, that I don't think she is. She does bite David and tell him that he's now infected, but she doesn't actually know. I take that as her desperate attempt to try and do something to save her life in that moment. She's about to be killed, after all, so she does what is probably the smartest move she has. Outside of this, we're not given any other evidence either way, except for the mutation itself, which it mutates in her brainstem so that the infection doesn't spread beyond that point. That would say to me that she is not infectious. As far as I'm concerned, Ellie will be able to have a relationship and have children and everything that entails. It may even be the case that her immunity is passed on to her children. That would make sense after all. The character of Joel is a complex monster, who doesn't even fully understand what he does or why. It also doesn't matter to him in most cases if he does understand. We know that Joel had his daughter when he was young, so young that her birth prevented him from going to college. This is likely because he had to start earning money straight away while still finding the time to raise his child. I had originally recorded a series of explanations as to why I thought Joel was 18 or 19 when Sarah was born, but I have since been directed to the official Last of Us site, which states that Joel is in his late 40s. To establish Joel's age in full, it is first necessary to determine Sarah's age. When first escorting Ellie, Joel asks her age, and he also makes a guess. That guess is 12, and I find this guess to be more than random. I find it critical of his character. Going by appearances alone, I would guess that Sarah was 12 years old, and I believe Joel's guess of Ellie's age is as close to confirmation as we can get. The Last of Us wiki also states this, but I prefer the evidence in-game. What does this mean for Joel's age? Well, knowing that he is in his late 40s at the start of the game, excluding the prologue, that would mean he is in his late 20s in the prologue. So, 28 or 29 in the prologue, and 48 or 49 in the game. This would also mean that when Sarah was born, Joel was either 16 or 17. That's young, but certainly not unheard of, and at least Joel was responsible enough to raise his daughter. In the prologue, he is speaking to Tommy, his younger brother, about a work-related issue. This means that Tommy is old enough to be working and attempting to carve out a living for himself as well. I consider Tommy to be fairly younger than Joel, by at least 5 years. This is simply going off of appearances. If Joel were 16, then Tommy would at least be 11, and then 23 in the prologue. Those Tommy numbers are rough, and just for the sake of it, we can't actually know. I do also want to say that it is likely that Joel turns 50 by the time the second summer occurs, the same way that Ellie likely has become 15. This is possibly credited by him mentioning that he now feels his age. As for Sarah's mother, we don't have any information except that we know Joel is disturbed when Ellie asks about her. He is unwilling to speak on the subject. We can also notice that in the house in the prologue there is not one picture of Sarah's mother. Not one. This is peculiar even if she and Joel split up, for she should still be a part of Sarah's life and of Joel's by relation. This is speculation, but between Joel's reaction to Ellie's question and the fact that there are no pictures, it is my guess that Sarah's mother died either during childbirth or early on afterward. You would still think a picture would be seen somewhere, but it is what it is. I also wonder if, because Sarah's mother would have also likely been a 16 or 17-year-old, there was a reason she could not be involved, aside from medical. I won't waste time with examples that are baseless, but I wish the game had given some hint. Moving on to the present, Joel is seemingly dating Tess, and also working with her in an aggressive partnership. It does not seem as if they have any long-term goals, but instead live day to day, or at least month to month, and this would be typical of any survivors. They are desperately interested in getting a large quantity of guns back from Robert, as proven by Tess telling Joel that the quantity is a lot when she returns after her leave with Marlene temporarily. To be fair, this stock is added to by Marlene, doubled, which still leaves the implication that the amount was originally more than 2 people should need. There is the part in which it's safe to have guns for defense and to use them for bartering, but I don't fully understand why Tess and Joel would need so many guns. They are specifically not a part of the Fireflies, nor acting as hunters at the time of the game's placement. Either way, I want to stress that Joel is not actually a good man, not in the sense of letting his moral compass guide him. What guides Joel is apparently only a sense of preservation, at the cost of a great violence if necessary. Outside of the fact that he kills hundreds of people, or at least can as you play the game, we can watch as Joel breaks Robert's arm near the beginning. He also doesn't flinch as Tess kills Robert or hears about the Fireflies being slaughtered. Later on in the game, Ellie questions Joel as to how he can know so much about the hunters, and Joel replies that he has been on both sides. We are playing him when he is on the side of the hunted, technically, so that means sometime before escorting Ellie he behaved as a hunter. This is not all that surprising, but it does mean that Joel murdered innocent people for their belongings. However, when Tess reminds him that they are not good people, Joel refutes the argument by claiming that they are survivors. He makes this distinction promptly, so either he has been living in avoidance of behaving as a true hunter, or feels guilt for actions taken in the past. I'm putting my own inference on this, but those are my guesses. Because of this moment, Joel stating that they were surviving, we can assume, thankfully, that at least Joel never raped or enslaved anyone. The game gives nothing in the way of this implication, and I am not going to believe it even for a moment because of that fact. What's most important about Joel is his slowly growing affection for Ellie, and how she becomes a parallel for his daughter as time goes on. The obvious things to point out are the fact that she is a young teenager who is strong-headed and requiring his help. His affection for her, as a father figure, surmounts slowly with the details. When he first begins smuggling Ellie, they rest away the afternoon in a safe house, while waiting for Tess to bring word of the guns promised by Marlene. When in this safe house, Ellie notices the watch still strapped to Joel's wrist, the one that Sarah gave him for his birthday only hours before she was killed. At that time, Joel made a joke that the watch was not working. 20 years later, Ellie glances at the watch and informs Joel that it is broken. That very same night, Joel is apparently dreaming, to the point that Ellie mentions that he mumbles in his sleep. We can't know for sure what Joel is dreaming about, but the guess is obvious. This is especially true since when Ellie further comments that she hates bad dreams, Joel replies, "Yeah, me too." As I said, we can't know for sure, but my guess is that he was dreaming of Sarah's demise due to being around Ellie. The next notion is when Joel and Tess are slightly arguing about whether or not Ellie's immunity could be real, and if they should complete the escort or not. To refute Joel's resistance, Tess looks between him and Ellie and says, "I get it." Even she is aware of what must be going through Joel's head, which is not only the fact that she is reminiscent of his lost daughter, but also, I speculate, that Joel is afraid of losing another child in the hellish world. But more to come on that shortly when we get to the end of the game. Before moving there, however, despite all that I just said about Ellie being a parallel for Sarah, I need to stress that the relationship is not father and daughter. The game specifically makes it so that we know this isn't the case. A lot of people don't see what I am about to state and will insist that they are supposed to be acting as parent and child. I can understand that entirely, and if this is the case for you, dear viewer, please just give me a chance. The relationship is close to father and daughter, and difficult to think of otherwise, but at the end of the dam section, Ellie runs off knowing that Joel is going to abandon her. Ellie establishes for us why she runs, because everyone else who she's cared about has either left her or died, save for Joel. It is Ellie who brings to Joel's attention that she is not his daughter, and this I consider a breaking point, but the good kind of break. Until that moment, Joel, in fact, had been considering Ellie to be his daughter. When I say consider, I don't mean that he had taken her under his wing as a child. I mean that the unfair connection had been established and was causing him to want to push her away. He absolutely wanted to abandon her, and this is because of how she made him feel. If you recall, in the hotel, a suicide scene can be discovered, and Ellie states that it must have been difficult. Joel responds to this by saying that this isn't the hard part. My take on that is that he is saying living beyond it is the hard part. Or, more appropriately, as finding a way not to choose suicide is the difficult part. He has done so with success by running from his past and focusing only on survival. This is his mantra, after all, as he states to Ellie at the very end of the game. Ellie brings up all those old feelings in him, and therefore Joel wants to ditch her as well, to continue dealing with his problems in his broken way. When Ellie corrects him that she is not his daughter, Joel snaps back in a seemingly cruel way that she's right that she is not, and that he is not her dad. It only seems cruel because it is Joel admitting that the relationship is something else. It would seem that Ellie was aware at a certain point of how Joel could be feeling. She gives the example of Maria telling her about Sarah, but I'm guessing it began earlier than that. She was probably aware that something was wrong, as she wants Joel to admit that he wanted to abandon her the entire journey. When she finds out about Sarah, it likely all clicks into place, and she wants her friend to understand them both better. Joel comes to the realization of how unfair he had been being. He no longer wants to abandon Ellie because for the first time he has begun to deal with his past. Instead of running from it and killing his way to sleep at night, he has formed a bond with someone that can help him heal. He can now care for Ellie as a friend, as a companion, and as someone who not only he can look out for, but who can look out for him. Most important, she will no longer be a spited-in version of Sarah, but her own person. The relationship ultimately changes on that day. I'm not saying that they are not as close as a father and daughter could be. They absolutely are, and I do not mean to diminish the strength of their feelings in any way. With certainty, the end of the game must be dissected, and it starts with understanding who Marlene is. We don't know much about her, but we know enough. She is the leader of the Fireflies, or at least one of the top members. Joel refers to her as a Queen Firefly, but it's never completely clarified if she is in charge of the entire organization or not. There are sects all around the country, and she could simply be one of the higher-ups in the organization, perhaps in charge of the Boston area or the Eastern Coast. What's also extremely important about Marlene is that she personally knows Ellie. She was a friend of Ellie's mother and knew the girl for her entire life. What this means in detail we will never know, but we do know that Marlene seemingly cared for Ellie a great deal. She also knows Tess and Joel on some level before hiring them to escort Ellie. She knows them by name, and likely because of Tommy. As said, he was a former Firefly, and I feel like the game just slightly hints that he and Marlene were once a couple. Could just be me, but it's actually not that important. What is important is that toward the beginning of the game, Marlene hires Joel and Tess because the Fireflies are being wiped out. We can witness an explosion in which Marlene states it was the rest of her people. This is further evidence, in my opinion, that she is simply the leader of a Boston or East Coast sect of Fireflies. She states her people are wiped out, but we know Firefly groups and facilities exist elsewhere. In fact, a large number of Firefly members are at the St. Mary's Hospital. Marlene becomes comfortable hiring Tess and Joel because she already knows them, and is unable to escort Ellie herself. This is because she has been wounded, a wound in which she lives through. Now, a quick word on the Fireflies themselves, and what Marlene is hoping to achieve. They are in 2 words, a rebellion. The rebelling is not unjustified either, as we've already gone over what a monster the government has become. People are basically used for slave labor, regarded as nothing more than something to control while the infection rages on. If they aren't working, they are being dragged from their homes as suspected terrorists. The Fireflies seek to put some semblance of order back to the country, as they are the ones who were seeking to reinstate the 3 primary branches of our government in the opening credits cinematic. Now, what has to be kept in mind about the Fireflies' determination is that it does include violence in its response. They are one side of a war being fought for control. What control actually means for the Fireflies 20 years in is never made clear. It's comforting to believe that they are neutrally good, but the events at the hospital promote otherwise. Speaking of the hospital, that brings us to the other primary Firefly goal, that of researching a cure. This hope exists outside of Ellie, as proven in the science facility at the university. The group of Fireflies stationed there had been experimenting on monkeys. The extent of this experiment is not fully known, but I want to take this opportunity to dissect this tiny amount of content. Joel and Ellie come across these monkeys, who take to running away both times they are approached. Interestingly, though, when Joel listens to the recorder right before the hunters attack, the Firefly becomes panicked after being bit by one of these monkeys. It really makes me wonder if they were on the road to a cure at the University of Eastern Colorado. The monkeys were apparently infected, shown also by the Firefly shooting himself and leaving behind his recorder, and yet they ran off both times humans approached. One time was when they were on horseback, but the other had Joel and Ellie only a meter or two away, easily within biting range. Not that the infected would ever care about a horse regardless. Does that mean that these monkeys were infected and yet not aggressive? I don't know of any infected that flee, but the Firefly's recorder suggested exactly this. Let's keep this in mind as we progress to the end of the game. Most people seem to want to break down the ending into whether or not Joel was selfish, and whether or not what he did was good or bad. These are two separate questions that require two separate answers. Additionally, I have a third question that I am going to address, which is what effect his choice has on Ellie. Here's what happens at the end, starting with the scene in which Ellie nearly drowns. Joel is attempting to save her, beginning CPR on an obvious kid. The Firefly Patrol walks up and not only insists that he stop, but clocks him unconscious. At first blush, I wanted to react to this by calling them assholes, but that isn't fair. We've already been shown a hunter pretending to be wounded and then slamming a bus into our protagonist's truck. What's to say a hunter couldn't pretend to be reviving someone else to get the edge on some unsuspecting Fireflies? Joel wakes up in the hospital a short while later to find Marlene and an armed guard standing over him. He is told that Ellie is all right. Also said is that most of Marlene's crew was lost crossing the country, and both she and Joel tentatively give the line that maybe this, Ellie arriving with the cure, was meant to be. Joel then asks to see Ellie, and Marlene attempts to dissuade him by saying that he doesn't have to worry about her any longer. Upon Joel's insistence, Marlene then explains that Joel cannot see her because she is being prepped for surgery. Joel questions this, and Marlene explains about her immunity. Joel tells her to find someone else, and Marlene truthfully states that there is no one else. She then tells Joel that his emotional trauma is nothing compared to what she has been through. Marlene explains that she has known Ellie since she was born, and that there is no other choice but to go through with the surgery, despite that it will kill her. Joel tells her that such statement is bullshit, and he is escorted away by the armed guard. Action ensues, and then Joel and Marlene meet up again, this time with Joel carrying Ellie away after having killed the surgeon who could create a cure. Marlene stops Joel at gunpoint and claims that Ellie can't be saved. She will either be killed by clickers or raped by hunters, and then killed. Marlene suggests that this, dying for the cure, is what Ellie would want. Joel's expression suggests that he is aware of this, and Marlene calls him out on it. Most of what I just said sure does seem to support the fact that Joel is a monster of sorts. He ends up shooting Marlene and taking Ellie away, lying to her after she wakes by saying that the Fireflies had many immune candidates, and that it did not matter because they could not create a cure. I know that was a rather large recapping of the story we already all know, but I felt it was required for me to prove that I understand what happens at the end, and that I have given it a large amount of thought. Here's the thing. What Joel said about Marlene feeding herself the bullshit of having to kill Ellie is absolutely true. It's more true than he even knows. I want to now flip this coin and Marlene on her head. You can find two recorders left behind by Marlene. The first has her explaining that she was told by the surgeon that Ellie has to be killed, and that she yelled at him for it. The host has to be eliminated for the parasite to be extracted. What does Marlene say this is medical slang for? I quote, "Fancy way of saying we gotta kill the fucking kid." The fucking kid? They, the other Fireflies we can assume, ask for her permission and she gives it, regardless of it being a formality. There was no protest apparently. In this same recorder, Marlene does state that the tests keep getting harder and harder. The tests? At first blush, this seems like a sign that she is emotionally struck, but then she goes on to state just how exhausted she is, and how very badly she wants it all to end. Not her life or the Fireflies, But no, wait. The second recorder comes first. The second recorder is a message to Anna, Ellie's mother, something Marlene does, I'm sure, to help herself cope. I'm not going to fault her for this in and of itself. However, she does go on to say that she's kept her promise after all these years, despite that she was doing so much else, like being a Firefly leader. Marlene attempts to state that she would have done anything for Ellie, but hesitates when saying, "and at times." Then she goes on to say that they have a chance to save all of us and to fulfill what she, Anna, was after. Marlene states that she doesn't want to kill Joel because he will understand the weight of her choice and hopefully forgive her. She needs someone to forgive her, and Joel is the only person remaining whose forgiveness would mean anything, because he also cares for Ellie. As far as I'm concerned, when Ellie became infected, her status changed in Marlene's head. Ellie never got the chance to be her own person in Marlene's eyes, as she became a parallel for Anna's cause, much in the way that Joel first only saw her as a daughter. When Marlene says that they can all be saved, she does not have a concern for Ellie, but only for herself and, more importantly, Anna's cause. This is what has been driving Marlene forward, which by itself is not such a bad notion. However, she has become blinded by this drive. That brings us now to what I'm going to call the triple bullshit threat. The first two are more scientific examples. First, there is the university and how apparently monkeys had the infection and yet were not necessarily aggressive. If you don't prescribe to this theory, that is on you. I won't blame you because the game doesn't actually say it, but please think about it again. The Firefly who left the recorder there shot himself to avoid turning, and was terrified after being bit by one of the monkeys. The critters run from Joel and Ellie twice, proving they are not behaving as infected. The second case of bullshit is the fact that the surgery to extract the parasite had to occur straight away. Why? Ellie was not in any immediate danger. In fact, at St. Mary's, she was at the safest point of her entire life. Hell, Joel was still there to make sure she remained safe as well. Why is her safety significant? Because the bullshit is that no other extraction method is sought. Ellie arrives, the surgeon takes a look at her, and decides he needs to kill a girl. That's harsh, but it's true. After a few months of research, perhaps recruiting some more medical doctors, and teaming up with Tommy's group for their use of electricity, who knows what kind of alternative they could have found. But no, it's immediately to the operating table, so that they can kill her in the hurried hopes of generating a cure. No real discussion, no pause to consider all the options. If you ask me, the Fireflies are beginning to sound like the monsters. Which brings us to our third piece of bullshit, the emotional bullshit. Let's go over the scenario once again, shall we? Joel is knocked unconscious and Ellie is already such. The former wakes up, after what would have only been a few hours, to learn that Ellie is being prepped for her death surgery. What? Does this make sense to anyone? Doesn't it feel as if something is missing? Seriously, Ellie went ahead and agreed to the surgery in which she'd die in that short of time? She didn't want to at least speak to Joel again? The last time she interacted with the person she cares about the most was during the chaos of being underwater in which she almost drowned. She doesn't want to explain to him her choice, that he is to respect her wishes, and most importantly, to say goodbye. Ellie is incredibly bright and tuned in to Joel. She knows that losing her would hurt him. She would want to assure him of her choice. I don't buy it for one damn second. And we don't have to. In the parking garage, Marlene says to Joel the following line when it comes to dying for the cure. It's what she'd want. I want to repeat that for emphasis, because two words there tell us everything. It's what she'd want. Not what she wants, she'd want. Marlene is a fucking liar and a true monster. Ellie was never consulted. Ellie had no idea that she was going to die. She probably never woke up from her slight drowning coma and was rushed to surgery for that very reason. So that they, no, just Marlene, did not have to deal with the emotional trauma of it. Marlene has stated just how tired she is, and how she wants it all to end. This is what she says, how she feels with making the decision to kill Ellie. Speaking to the girl, explaining to her the weight of her choice, the choice that should be granted, would be too much for Marlene. She'd rather just send the girl to her death, so that it would be over. That is why she says it is what Ellie would want. She doesn't actually know, and she doesn't care to find out. It's the only explanation for all of it, and I absolutely hate Marlene because of it. On a personal level, let me also say that I sit on the side of not bothering to save humanity. I don't want to be a big downer, but I've already said that I believe how humanity acts in The Last of Us is how they would in real life. Between the military and the hunters, between the imprisonment, killing, and rape, what is there to save? It is a waste of time to create a cure, especially when doing so means eliminating one of the few worthwhile people in this world. Now, I do want to be fair in that when Marlene says that the sacrifice would be what Ellie would want, Joel does give an expression of admittance. Marlene calls him out on this because it's true that Ellie is emotionally unstable. Joel is partially making a choice for her, selfishly, by taking her from the hospital and from being used as a method to create a cure. However, he is left without much of a choice. This is why the majority of us who played the game tend to agree with Joel's actions. If the Fireflies would have waited and listened, done more research, and at the very least spoken to Ellie, then things would be different. If Ellie was made aware of everything and understood all the options and still chose to die, then it would be Joel's turn to either accept her decision or act as a monster. That isn't the case, however. He may be slightly out of line to take her and lie, but the Fireflies are outrageous in sacrificing her. Besides, what Joel admits to, that Ellie would want the cure, is not the same as wanting to die. Ellie doesn't want to die. That is an exaggeration. A part of her may be feeling that, but we have to keep in mind one very important thing. She is a 14-year-old girl. Most teenagers are hormonal and have wild swings with their emotions. This is nothing new. Ellie has all too recently experienced a great amount of trauma, having to kill her way out of being kidnapped and raped. She had to act in ways no one should ever have to, and her recovery is going to be long and slow. In years to come, as she adjusts to a more normal life in Jackson, Ellie's outlook on life, her past, and her future would alter. She would want to continue to survive, or maybe if she found out a cure could still be obtained, and that her life was necessary to give, she would be able to approach the choice rationally. What Joel did was selfish because there's no denying that he in part did it for himself. For the first time in 20 years, he has someone he cares about as much as his only daughter. However, don't think for a second that what he did was not also for Ellie. Despite all the horrors of it, and the lie he had to tell, he behaved as a friend on that day, and he definitely did the right thing by Ellie.